Hi guys, Professor Graywood here. As always, this is not a substitute for reading your chapter, but it does provide some depth for understanding the cultural and economic foundations of Middle America. Western Europe took an interest in the Caribbean in the 15 through the 1800s for a number of reasons. Number one, for commercial profit. For gold, for things like colonial commercial interests, like sugar production. Did you know by the 1750s sugar was Britain's greatest import? Lands that were devoted to food crops for local consumption were appropriated and converted to cash cropping for export. We also saw Europeans see the New World as a source of status or new land and a place for religious conversion. For example, the Spanish upper classes, or those who aspired to be so, saw land acquisition as a way to rise in ranks, or to signal their rise in ranks. One immediate result of this, whether it was commercial profit or status acquisition, was land alienation for local populations and genocide. Land alienation is one society taking land from another. Genocide, if you're unfamiliar with it, is the deliberate killing of entire ethnic groups or cultures. Now, when we look at the legacy of colonialism in the New World, in this part of the New World, we really can break it down into a mainland-rimland framework. Colonialism formed really interesting cultural and economic patterns that we can generalize into two different types of two different regions in Middle America. We have the mainland that you see on the map here, which consists of most of the Central Isthmus, and then we have the rimland, which consists of the Greater Antilles, which are our larger islands out in the Caribbean, as well as the Lesser Antilles, which are our smaller islands out in the eastern portion of the Caribbean, and then a very narrow band of the coastline of the isthmus. Now, in the rimland, a commercial for-profit agenda was followed, and fairly quickly a plantation economy developed. Now, this plantation economy was based on single crop production, based on trade with foreign markets. And this makes excellent sense due to their great port access with foreign locations. But you need to keep in mind that their economies fluctuated because all of their economies hinged around demand in those foreign markets, and foreign markets set their prices. Production was most commonly in sugar, but smaller markets did exist in tobacco and indigo. There was heavy emphasis on efficiency and productivity in the rimland area. They were not self-sufficient operations, but they traded abroad for goods that they needed to run their plantations. The key feature to understand here is that there were no local cottage industries, and cottage industries are something we will talk about in the future, but for now, keep in mind that these are the forerunners of industrialization. So with no local cottage industries developing, there's really no seeds for industrialization to ever develop in the rimland. There's also a very strong Euro-African influence. Famine, disease, overwork kill off the natives in these areas. No Caribbean Indian tribes survived the brutal process of European colonization. Entire civilizations, like that of the Taino Indians, no longer exist. Instead, the labor force quickly consisted almost entirely of slaves that are imported from West Africa, and these people were seen as disposable property for short-term ownership. While the vast majority of the population were made up of people of West African descent, some sexual encounters with Europeans would lead to a blending, now commonly referred to as people of mulatto descent. Plantation owners generally did not intend to live out their lives on these properties. Primary documents indicate many intended to make their fortunes and get out as quickly as possible. This is a really key feature to understand as well, because this means little investment in the local infrastructure or the local culture occurred unless it was motivated to get products to the marketplace. Many of the patterns that are set up in the colonial period have continued through the present day. Now, by contrast, when we look at the mainland, it's a very different pattern. By the time the Spanish began to colonize mainland portions of the realm, and they were the main colonizers, their agendas had changed significantly. While they initially viewed the area as a space to extract gold, once these deposits and cultural treasures were depleted, they began to see other resources they could use, probably most importantly, land and potential Catholics. The Spanish crown took its mandate to convert local populations very seriously, and it sent a large number of clergy to complete this goal. And additionally, they viewed the local land as available for granting to friends of the crown. Essentially, anyone who'd done service to the crown might be granted a piece of land in the New World. So this was an easy way to gain status and become part of the landed gentry in a world that was in many ways still feudal. Large land grants, called haciendas, were the prevailing norm on the mainland area. And this makes sense, since that plantation system wouldn't work well here anyway. Many of these lands were in greater isolation from world markets than what we saw in the Rimland, in the interior of that isthmus. So these large estates were owned by Spanish families motivated by social prestige instead of profit. So they're relatively inefficient, but they are self-sufficient. They grow a variety of crops and they produce everything the family and workers need to survive on their own. There's very little trade with Spain that's necessary unless it's for luxury goods. Workers live on site and they're given small pieces of land to work in exchange for their assistance, very similar to the sort of feudal arrangements you saw back in Spain. This legacy still survives today, particularly in northern Mexico, where some of these large land grants still survive intact. This means that you see a very strong Euro-Indian influence in these areas. Here the local native populations are able to persist. They aren't worked to death like they are on the islands. Life may not have been wonderful, and they may not have been able to keep their original culture, and they may have been forced to convert to Catholicism, but populations were able to survive. Local native and European groups intermingle, and they produce a people we call mestizo in heritage. Mainland settlers mean to stay here for the long haul. They develop long-term improvements to the infrastructure. They create strong economies with local linkages that are independent of world markets. So when independence finally comes to these regions, they would be far healthier than their Rimland cousins. So let's look at the long-term effects of colonization then. Let's just compare and contrast these two systems again, really quickly. So in the plantation system, we have this export-driven economy. We have little to no manufacturing that is occurring. All of our manufactured goods are imported. Prices are set by the colonizing power. Small family agricultural plots are converted to large plantations. And in the hacienda system, we have a self-sufficient economy. We have possibilities for cottage industries to form. We have trade developing within the local region, with small family agricultural plots converted to large haciendas. In both places, we have land alienation occurring, and that land alienation is inducing famine and poverty and migration. We see genocide occurring. We see cultural assimilation occurring. But what this produces, the effects of these things, are very different in each location. Plantation economies produce very little agricultural diversity. They produce a large unskilled labor force. They're really not equipped to work in industries outside of agriculture. They don't produce a decent infrastructure. There's very little improvement to public roads, to water or sewer lines, to utilities, or to local economic trade networks. We have very little capital that is available for investment. Money that is earned in the plantation economy circulates to locations outside of the colony. It doesn't stay local. By contrast, our hacienda economies produce much agricultural diversity. They produce the possibility of a skilled labor force. There may be the prospect of the formation of cottage industries if individuals within the hacienda specialize in the production of specific sorts of goods. You see improved infrastructure as people who are staying for the long haul invest in public roads, they invest in utilities, and we see sustained improvement over time as local funding and current technology allows. We see sustained development of local economic relationships as communities trade for specialized goods with one another. There's capital available for investment now because money earned is money that stays within the community. So by the time independence comes to these areas, and you can see on your map exactly when independence comes to each of these locations, we have very different effects that result. The cultural and economic patterns that are established during this colonial period become the foundations for the future. The economies and infrastructure of the mainland are generally better developed, and they're decidedly more mestizo in nature, and the economies of the rimland are much more poorly developed. These islands still exhibit a great deal of West African cultural influence, and they still lack infrastructure and skilled labor forces.